After my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law leaned close to me and whispered, "Sign here, old hag. Then pack your bags and go live in the gutter." With the whole family watching, I just smiled. Minutes later, I quietly pulled a document from my purse. And the truth made her faint on the spot. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The rain had stopped, but the gray clouds still hung heavy over Woodlawn Cemetery as the last handful of dirt hit Robert's mahogany casket. 43 years of marriage, and this was how it ended, with me standing alone while our family gathered around his grave, and my daughter-in-law Yara positioning herself like she owned the place. I clutched my black purse tighter, feeling the weight of the envelope inside. The same envelope I'd been carrying for 3 months, waiting for this exact moment. Robert had been so careful when he'd given it to me, his hands shaking not from illness, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. "Mom, Faye, you're looking pale," said my son Marcus, Yara's husband, as he approached with fake concern. Behind him, Yara wore a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching what little sunlight managed to break through the clouds. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I replied, forcing a smile. At 67, I'd learned to hide my feelings well. Too well, perhaps. The other mourners began to disperse, offering their condolences and promising to call soon, promises I knew most wouldn't keep. My daughter Lisa gave me a brief hug before hurrying to her car, muttering something about her kids needing to be picked up from school. My youngest son David shook my hand like I was a distant acquaintance, not the woman who'd changed his diapers and sat up with him through countless fevers. That's when Yara made her move. She waited until only immediate family remained, then walked over to me with that predatory smile I'd come to recognize over the past 5 years. The same smile she'd worn when she convinced Robert to stop our weekly bridge games because they were too stressful for his heart. The same smile she'd used when she suggested I might be more comfortable in a retirement community. "Faye," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we need to talk about practical matters." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of papers. The top page was already filled out in her neat handwriting, with lines highlighted in yellow where my signature was supposed to go. "What's this?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. "Property transfer documents," Yara announced, not even bothering to lower her voice. Marcus, David, and Lisa all turned to look at us, their conversations trailing off. Robert and I discussed this extensively before he passed. "The house is too big for you now, and frankly, at your age, it's not safe for you to live alone." My hands trembled as I took the papers. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was crystal clear. I was being asked to sign over the house Robert and I had bought as newlyweds, the home where we'd raised our 3 children, where I'd planned to live out my remaining years surrounded by 43 years of memories. "There's a lovely assisted living facility about 20 minutes from here," Yara continued, her voice getting louder, more confident. "We've already put down a deposit on a studio apartment for you. Of course, we'll need you to sign these papers today so we can get the house on the market quickly. The real estate agent says spring is the perfect time to sell." The cemetery had gone completely quiet, except for the sound of wind through the oak trees. Our family stood frozen, watching this scene unfold like spectators at a car accident. My son Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes. Lisa was staring at her shoes. David had his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. Nobody was going to defend me. Nobody was going to say this was wrong. "Sign here, old woman," Yara whispered, leaning close enough that only I could hear. Her breath smelled like mint and malice. "Then pack your things and get out of my house. Time for you to learn your place." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not just the cruelty of them, but the timing. Here, at my husband's graveside, in front of our children, she was stripping away everything I had left. The house, my independence, my dignity, all of it gone with the stroke of a pen. But then I remembered Robert's words from 3 months ago, when he'd pressed that envelope into my hands with tears streaming down his face. "Faye, my love," he'd whispered, "I'm so sorry. I should have seen through her sooner, but I've fixed it now. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." I looked at Yara's expectant face, at my children's uncomfortable silence, at the papers that would make me homeless and powerless. Then I smiled. "Of course, dear," I said sweetly, reaching into my purse. "But first, there's something you should see." I pulled out the manila envelope Robert had given me, the one I'd kept safe in my bedroom drawer for 3 months, waiting for this moment. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with the letterhead of Henderson and Associates, the law firm Robert had used for 30 years. Yara's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "What's that?" "Robert's real will," I said calmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The one he made without telling you. The one that explains exactly what he thought of your little schemes." I watched the color drain from Yara's face as I opened the envelope and pulled out the documents inside. Her hands started to shake, and she took a step backward. "That's impossible," she stammered. "Robert would have told me. We made our will together just 6 months ago. Everything goes to Marcus, and Marcus agreed that I should handle the estate affairs since you're not. Since you're getting older." I unfolded the first page of the will, dated just 4 months before Robert's death. My husband's signature was clear and strong at the bottom, witnessed by 2 people I recognized as employees from his accountant's office. "Apparently," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart, "Robert had some concerns about that arrangement." Yara lunged forward, trying to grab the papers from my hands. "Let me see that." "You're lying." But as her eyes scanned the first paragraph, something extraordinary happened. The woman who had just humiliated me at my husband's grave, who had been planning to throw me out of my own home, who had spent the last 5 years systematically destroying my relationship with my children, this woman, who seemed so powerful and in control, simply crumpled. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed right there in the cemetery grass, the transfer papers she'd wanted me to sign scattering in the wind like the dead leaves around Robert's grave. As Marcus rushed to help his unconscious wife and my other children stared in shock, I carefully folded Robert's will and put it back in my purse. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like I could breathe again. 3 months earlier, I had been sitting in my kitchen at 6 in the morning, stirring honey into my tea and watching the sunrise paint our backyard golden, when I heard voices coming from Robert's study. This wasn't unusual. He'd been having more and more business meetings at home since his heart attack the previous year. What made me pause was the tone of Yara's voice, sharp and insistent in a way she never used when she knew I was listening. "The doctor said her memory is getting worse, Robert. Yesterday she asked me the same question 3 times in one afternoon." I set down my teacup, my heart suddenly racing. They were talking about me. "I don't know, Yara." Robert's voice sounded tired, defeated. "She seems fine to me most of the time. That's how it starts," Yara pressed on. "My grandmother went through the same thing. The family was in denial for years while she got progressively worse. By the time we faced reality, she'd nearly burned down her house trying to cook dinner." I crept closer to the study door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Through the crack where the door hadn't quite closed, I could see them sitting at Robert's desk. Yara had papers spread out in front of her, and she was leaning forward with that earnest expression she used when she wanted something. "The important thing is to get everything in order while she still has good days," Yara continued. "If we wait too long, the courts might get involved, and then everything becomes complicated. You don't want strangers making decisions about Faye's care, do you?" Robert shook his head slowly. He looked so much older than his 71 years. His shoulders curved with exhaustion and grief over his declining health. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. Yara pulled out a thick document and placed it in front of him. "Just a simple revision to your will. Instead of leaving everything directly to Faye, you leave it to Marcus with instructions that he's responsible for her care. That way, when she reaches the point where she can't make decisions for herself, there won't be any legal complications." My blood turned to ice. There was nothing wrong with my memory. Yes, I occasionally asked Yara to repeat herself, but that was because I'd learned not to trust anything she said the first time. I'd started paying closer attention to her words, looking for the lies and manipulations I'd begun to suspect. "I don't like the idea of changing our will without discussing it with Faye," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Of course we'll discuss it with her," Yara said smoothly. But think about how frightening this must be for her, Robert, having to face the reality that her mind is going. Wouldn't it be kinder to handle the practical matters quietly, so she doesn't have to worry about being a burden? That word, burden, hit me like a slap. In 43 years of marriage, Robert had never once made me feel like a burden. But lately, I'd noticed changes in him. He'd stopped asking my opinion about things. He'd started making excuses when I wanted to go places together. He'd even suggested that maybe I should stop driving at night, just to be safe. She did seem confused last week when we went to the bank, Robert admitted reluctantly. She couldn't remember our account number. Of course I couldn't remember it, because Yara had convinced him to change banks 6 months ago, and she'd handled all the paperwork while I was visiting Lisa in Portland. She'd made sure I was left out of the process entirely, then acted surprised when I didn't know the new account details. Exactly, Yara said, her voice gentle but insistent. And it's only going to get worse. The kindest thing we can do is make sure she's protected. Protected from having to make difficult decisions. Protected from people who might try to take advantage of her condition. I watched through the crack as she placed her hand over Robert's, her wedding ring catching the morning light. The ring that had once been mine, passed down from my grandmother. Yara had admired it so much when she and Marcus got engaged that I'd given it to her as a welcome to the family gift. Now it felt like she was wearing a piece of my identity. I just want what's best for her, Robert said softly. I know you do, Yara replied. That's why Marcus and I want to help. We're thinking we should probably move in here, at least temporarily, to keep an eye on things. And maybe it would be better if Faye didn't drive anymore. We could take her wherever she needs to go. The manipulation was so smooth, so careful. She wasn't suggesting that they take control of my life all at once. Instead, she was offering to help, to keep an eye on things, to protect me. Each suggestion sounded reasonable on its own, but together they would strip away every piece of my independence. What about David and Lisa? Robert asked. Shouldn't they be involved in these decisions? Yara's smile was sharp. Well, David lives 3 states away, and Lisa has her hands full with her own family. Marcus and I are here, we're available, and we love Faye just as much as they do. Besides, too many people involved just makes everything more complicated. You know how families can fight over these kinds of decisions. I had heard enough. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the door and returned to the kitchen. I sat at our breakfast table, the same table where Robert and I had shared coffee every morning for 20 years, and tried to process what I'd just learned. My daughter-in-law was systematically convincing my husband that I was losing my mind. She was isolating me from my other children and positioning herself as my caretaker. And worst of all, she was using Robert's love for me as a weapon against me. For the rest of that day, I watched Robert carefully. I noticed how he hesitated before answering when I asked him questions, as if he was evaluating my mental state. I saw how he exchanged glances with Yara when I mentioned forgetting where I'd put my reading glasses. I realized that every small, normal moment of forgetfulness or confusion was being cataloged as evidence of my declining mental capacity. That evening, after Yara and Marcus had gone home, I confronted Robert directly. "Robert," I said as we got ready for bed, "is there something you want to tell me about my health?" He paused in buttoning his pajamas, and I saw guilt flash across his face. "What do you mean? I mean, have you noticed changes in me? Problems with my memory or my thinking?" He sat down heavily on the edge of our bed, suddenly looking exhausted. "Faye, I don't want you to worry about this, but Yara has mentioned some concerns." So I listened as my husband of 43 years told me about all the ways I was supposedly failing. How I'd asked the same question twice during a family dinner. How I'd seemed confused about our new bank account. How I'd gotten lost coming home from the grocery store last month. Though I knew perfectly well that I'd stopped to visit Mrs. Henderson next door and simply hadn't thought to mention it. Each example sounded damning when presented as evidence of mental decline, but I knew the truth. I knew that Yara had deliberately excluded me from the bank account setup. I knew that she often gave me vague or contradictory answers that forced me to ask for clarification. I knew that she was creating situations designed to make me look confused and incompetent. The question was What was I going to do about it? That night, lying next to Robert in the dark, listening to his labored breathing, I made a decision. If Yara wanted to play games with my family's future, then I would learn to play them too. But I would play them better, and I would play them quietly until the moment came to reveal exactly what I'd discovered. I would let her think she was winning, right up until the moment she lost everything. Once I understood what Yara was doing, I started seeing her manipulations everywhere. It was like someone had handed me a pair of glasses, and suddenly the blurry world came into sharp, terrifying focus. The phone calls were the first thing I noticed. Every morning at precisely 9:30, Yara would call Robert to check in. She'd ask about his medications, his doctor's appointments, and then, almost casually, she'd mention something about me. How was Faye this morning? Did she remember to take her vitamins? Oh, she seemed a little confused yesterday when I asked about the grocery list. I started listening to these conversations from the kitchen extension, something I'd never done in 43 years of marriage. The guilt of eavesdropping on my own husband was almost unbearable, but I had to know what she was telling him. "Robert, I'm worried about the stove," she said during one call. "Yesterday I found a pot of water boiling with nothing in it. Faye said she'd forgotten what she was cooking. What if she'd left the house?" The truth was that I'd been sterilizing my canning jars for the peach preserves I made every August, the same preserves our family had been enjoying for 20 years. But Yara had interrupted me while the water was boiling, insisting we needed to have an important conversation about Robert's medication schedule. By the time we finished talking, I'd naturally forgotten about the empty pot. "Maybe we should think about getting her one of those medical alert devices," Yara suggested, "just in case something happens when you're not around." The medical alert device arrived 3 days later. Yara presented it to me like it was a thoughtful gift, explaining how it would give Robert peace of mind. The pendant was ugly and heavy, and wearing it made me feel like an invalid. But when I hesitated to put it on, both Robert and Yara looked at me with such concern that I felt obligated to wear it. That's when I realized how clever she was. Every suggestion came wrapped in love and concern. Every restriction was presented as being for my own good. When she convinced Robert that I shouldn't drive at night anymore, it was because she cared about my safety. When she started coming over every day to help with household tasks, it was because she wanted to ease my burden. The helper's visits started small. Yara would drop by with groceries, claiming she'd been at the store anyway. She'd stay to help me put them away, reorganizing my cabinets in the process. "Faye, honey, you had 3 boxes of cereal," she'd say with a gentle laugh. "I think you forgot you already had some." Of course I had 3 boxes. I'd always kept backup supplies in case we ran out. But she made it sound like evidence of confusion, not careful planning. She started showing up during my weekly bridge games with my 3 closest friends. We'd been meeting every Thursday for 15 years, rotating between our homes. But suddenly, Yara was concerned about me overexerting myself. "Maybe the ladies could come here instead of you going out," she suggested to Robert. "That way you can keep an eye on things." When she came to our next bridge game, she hovered nearby, offering refreshments and making small talk. But I noticed how she watched me, how she'd exchange meaningful looks with Robert whenever I had to think about a play or couldn't immediately remember what cards had been played. "Bridge is getting pretty complicated for someone your age," she mentioned casually after my friends left. "All those cards to keep track of, all those rules to remember. Maybe a simpler game would be less stressful." My friends started calling less frequently. When I asked Ruth, my oldest friend, why we hadn't scheduled our next game, she hesitated. "Well, Faye, Marcus mentioned that you've been having some challenges lately. We don't want to add to your stress." Marcus, who had heard it from Yara, who had heard it from Robert, who had heard it from Yara in the first place. She was creating a circle of whispered concerns that made everyone around me believe I was fragile and failing. The grocery store incident was perhaps her masterpiece of manipulation. We'd gone shopping together, something that had never been a problem before. But Yara kept distracting me with questions and comments while I was trying to remember what I needed to buy. Did you remember to bring your list? She asked as we walked through the produce section. I patted my purse. Of course. Good, because I noticed you seemed a little forgetful this morning. You asked Robert about his doctor's appointment twice. I hadn't asked twice. I'd asked once, and then later I'd mentioned that I hoped the appointment went well. But her comment made me doubt myself. Had I asked twice? Was I becoming forgetful? While I was distracted by this worry, I accidentally put a bag of apples in my purse instead of the cart. It was an absent-minded mistake, the kind anyone might make when they're thinking about something else. But Yara noticed immediately. Faye, she said loudly enough for other shoppers to hear, you put those apples in your purse. The way she said it, with such surprised concern, made it sound like I was trying to steal them. Other customers turned to look. The young cashier gave me a sympathetic smile that made me feel ancient and confused. Oh my, I said, feeling my face burn with embarrassment as I moved the apples to the cart. I don't know why I did that. It's okay, honey, Yara said, rubbing my arm in a gesture that looked comforting but felt condescending. These things happen. That's why I'm here to help. By the time we got home, the story had already reached Robert. Yara told me what happened at the store, he said gently. Maybe it would be better if you didn't go shopping alone anymore. That's when I understood the true scope of what she was doing. She wasn't just trying to make me look incompetent, she was systematically removing every aspect of my independence. No more driving at night, no more bridge games, no more grocery shopping alone. Each restriction seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation, but together they were transforming me into someone who couldn't function without supervision. The financial manipulation was even more insidious. Yara convinced Robert that I was getting confused about money and that it would be simpler if he handled all our accounts. She helped him set up online banking, showing him how much easier it was than writing checks. See how much time this saves? She said, sitting beside him at his computer. And there's no chance of making mistakes in the checkbook. I'd been balancing our checkbook for 43 years without problems, but suddenly my mathematical skills were in question. When I mentioned that our account balance seemed lower than I expected, Yara was quick to explain. Remember, Robert had to pay that extra medical bill last month. And you went a little overboard at the department store, honey. We talked about this. I hadn't gone overboard anywhere. The extra charges were from services I'd never authorized. But when I questioned them, both Robert and Yara looked at me with such patience and concern that I began to doubt my own memory. The most devastating part was watching my relationship with my other children deteriorate. David called less frequently, and when he did call, his conversations with me were careful and brief. Lisa started directing most of her questions to Robert instead of me. How's Mom doing? I heard her ask Robert during one phone call. Not, how are you doing? To me directly, but, how's Mom doing? As if I weren't capable of answering for myself. When I tried to talk to Lisa about what was happening, she was gentle but dismissive. Mom, I think you're being a little paranoid. Yara's just trying to help. Maybe you should be grateful instead of suspicious. Grateful. The word stung because I could see how reasonable it all looked from the outside. Yara was the devoted daughter-in-law, sacrificing her time to care for her aging mother-in-law. I was the ungrateful old woman, too proud to accept help. But I knew what I knew. And late at night, when Robert was sleeping and the house was quiet, I started keeping a journal. I wrote down every conversation, every incident, every moment when Yara's help felt more like sabotage. I documented the day she rearranged my medication organizer, claiming she was making it easier for me, then expressed concern when I took the wrong pills because of her new system. I recorded the evening she suggested I might be more comfortable, wearing sweatpants to dinner instead of the dress I'd chosen, making me feel overdressed and foolish in my own home. I noted every time she answered questions directed at me, every time she spoke for me, every time she made decisions about my life without asking my opinion. The journal became my anchor to reality. When everyone around me was treating me like I was losing my mind, I had written proof that I was thinking clearly. I had evidence of what was really happening. I just had to figure out what to do with it. The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, our next-door neighbor of 20 years. She was 92 and sharp as a tack, and she'd been watching the increasing number of visitors to our house with curiosity. "That daughter-in-law of yours certainly is devoted," she mentioned one morning when I was getting the mail. "I see her here almost every day now." "Yes," I said carefully. "She's very helpful." "Mrs. Patterson studied my face with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through 9 decades of human behavior. "Sometimes too much help isn't helpful at all," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's something else entirely." That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door with a plate of cookies and a piece of advice that would change everything. "Faye," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she belonged there, "I think you need a lawyer." Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in my mind for 3 days before I worked up the courage to act on them. The idea of going behind Robert's back, of secretly consulting a lawyer about my own family, felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about marriage. But as I watched Yara systematically dismantle my life, I realized that loyalty was a two-way street. I chose Thursday morning for my visit to Henderson & Associates, the same law firm Robert had used for decades. Thursday was when Yara took Robert to his weekly cardiology appointment, giving me a guaranteed 2 hours of freedom. I told them I was going to the library, which wasn't entirely a lie. I planned to stop there afterward to create an alibi. James Henderson Jr. had taken over his father's practice 10 years earlier, but he still remembered me from the Christmas parties and firm dinners Robert and I had attended over the years. When I called to request a private consultation, he seemed surprised but didn't ask questions. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, standing to greet me as his secretary showed me into his office. "How can I help you today?" I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk, my hands gripping my purse so tightly my knuckles were white. For a moment, I couldn't find the words. How do you tell someone that your own family is conspiring against you? How do you explain that the people who claim to love you are systematically destroying your independence? "James," I finally said, "I need to know about my legal rights. Specifically, what my daughter-in-law can and cannot do regarding my care and my property." His eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "Are you concerned about something specific?" So I told him everything. About the conversations I'd overheard, about the gradual restrictions on my activities, about the way Yara was positioning herself as my caretaker while making me appear incompetent. I pulled out my journal and read him specific examples, watching his expression grow more serious with each entry. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said when I finished, "what you're describing sounds like a pattern of undue influence. Has your husband made any recent changes to his will or other legal documents?" My heart sank. "I don't know. Yara suggested he should, but he said he'd discuss it with me first. He hasn't mentioned anything." James leaned back in his chair, considering. "I need to tell you something, and I hope you'll understand why I'm sharing this information. Your husband did come to see me 6 weeks ago. He wanted to revise his will. The room seemed to tilt. What kind of revisions? He wanted to change the primary beneficiary from you to your son Marcus, with provisions that Marcus would be responsible for your care and living arrangements." James's voice was gentle but firm. "I advised him against making such a significant change without involving you in the discussion. I told him that any major estate planning decisions should include both spouses." "What did he say?" "He seemed conflicted. He mentioned concerns about your mental health, but when I pressed him for specifics, his examples seemed minor and normal for someone your age. I got the impression that someone else was driving this decision. Relief flooded through me. Robert hadn't changed the will yet. There was still time. "James, I need you to understand something very clearly," I said, leaning forward. "There is nothing wrong with my mental health. I am not confused, I am not incompetent, and I do not need a caretaker. What I need is protection from someone who is trying to manipulate my husband into believing otherwise." "I believe you," he said simply. "The question is, what do you want to do about it?" We spent the next hour crafting a strategy. James explained that at 67, I had every right to make my own legal and financial decisions. He also explained that if Robert did change his will under undue influence, there would be grounds to contest it, but that prevention was better than litigation. The best protection you have is evidence, James told me. Continue documenting everything, but also consider having witnesses to Yara's behavior. And I'd recommend getting an independent medical evaluation to establish your mental competency. I left his office with a plan, and for the first time in months, a sense of hope. But I also left with the knowledge that my husband had been one signature away from betraying everything we'd built together. The medical evaluation was easier to arrange than I'd expected. Dr. Sarah Chen, my longtime physician, was more than willing to conduct a comprehensive cognitive assessment when I explained my concerns. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said after 2 hours of tests, "your cognitive function is well within normal ranges for someone your age. Your memory, reasoning, and decision-making abilities show no signs of impairment. In fact, your scores are quite impressive." She handed me a written report documenting my mental competency, dated and signed. "I'm also going to recommend that you see Dr. Martinez, our neuropsychologist, for an even more detailed assessment. Given what you've told me about your family situation, you'll want documentation that's absolutely unassailable." The neuropsychological evaluation took 4 hours spread across 2 appointments. Dr. Martinez put me through tests I'd never imagined: puzzles, memory games, problem-solving exercises that reminded me of the crosswords I did every morning. When it was over, he was even more definitive than Dr. Chen. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're functioning at a level that's superior to most people your age. There's no evidence of cognitive decline, dementia, or any condition that would impair your judgment. Anyone suggesting otherwise is either misinformed or has an agenda." Armed with these reports, I felt ready for the next phase of my plan, but I needed help, and I knew exactly who to ask. Ruth Goldstein had been my closest friend for 23 years. We'd met at a hospital fundraiser when our children were young, and we'd supported each other through everything from teenagers to divorces to health scares. If anyone would understand what I was going through, it would be Ruth. I invited her for coffee on a Friday morning, when I knew Yara would be at her yoga class and Robert would be napping. Ruth arrived with her usual energy, carrying a bag of pastries from our favorite bakery and chatting about her new grandson. But when I told her what had been happening, her demeanor changed completely. "Faye," she said, setting down her coffee cup with a sharp clink, "why didn't you tell me about this sooner?" "Because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me," I admitted. "Yara's very good at making everything sound reasonable." Ruth was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You know, some things make sense now. The last few times we've talked on the phone, you seemed different, more hesitant, less confident. I thought maybe you were just having a rough time with Robert's health issues." That's exactly what she wanted people to think. "What do you need from me?" Ruth asked without hesitation. I pulled out a small recording device James Henderson had helped me purchase. "I need witnesses. I need people to see and hear what she's really like when she thinks she's in control." Ruth's eyes widened. "You want me to spy on your daughter-in-law? I want you to come to dinner next Sunday. Act normal but pay attention. Watch how she treats me, how she speaks for me, how she undermines me. I need someone else to see what I see." "Done," Ruth said immediately. "What else?" "I need you to call Robert sometimes when Yara's here. Ask to speak to me directly, not to her. See how she responds. And if you notice anything at all, that seems off, I need you to document it." Over the next 3 weeks, Ruth became my secret ally. She started dropping by unexpectedly, always with some innocent excuse. She was in the neighborhood, she had extra vegetables from her garden, she wanted to borrow a book. But really, she was gathering evidence. The Sunday dinner was particularly revealing. Ruth watched as Yara answered questions directed at me, corrected me when I told stories about our past, and suggested I might be too tired to help clear the table. "Faye seems to be doing very well," Ruth said pointedly to Robert. "Very sharp, very engaged." "Oh, she has good days and bad days," Yara said quickly. "Today's one of her better days, thankfully." Ruth caught my eye across the table, and I saw understanding pass between us. Yara had just dismissed my competence in front of a witness, making it sound like my normal behavior was unusual. After dinner, Ruth pulled me aside in the kitchen. "That woman is dangerous," she whispered. "I've never seen manipulation like that. She's rewriting reality right in front of everyone." The evidence continued to accumulate. Ruth documented phone calls where Yara claimed I was having a confused day when I was thinking perfectly clearly. She witnessed Yara rearranging my kitchen to make things easier, then expressing concern when I couldn't find items in their new locations. Most importantly, Ruth was there the day Yara made her biggest mistake. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Ruth had stopped by to return a casserole dish. Yara was visiting, as she did most days now, and she was going through my mail with the casual entitlement of someone who considered herself the head of household. "Faye, honey, you got another bill from the credit card company," Yara said, holding up an envelope. "This is the third notice. Are you sure you're keeping track of your payments?" I frowned. "I pay that bill every month. I've never missed a payment." "Well, according to this, you're 68 days overdue," Yara said, opening the envelope without asking my permission. "The balance is now $847 with late fees." My heart started racing. I was meticulous about paying bills. I had been for 43 years. There was no way I was behind on my credit card payments. "Let me see that," I said, reaching for the statement. Yara hesitated for just a moment too long before handing it over, and in that moment, I saw something in her eyes that confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The statement showed charges I didn't recognize. A payment to a landscaping company we'd never used, several charges at stores I never shopped at, and the payments that should have been made from my checking account had never gone through. "I don't understand," I said, studying the statement. "These charges aren't mine." "Oh, honey," Yara said with that familiar tone of patient condescension. "We talked about this, remember? You asked me to help with some errands last month, but Ruth was watching from the doorway, and she saw what I saw, the flash of satisfaction in Yara's eyes before she composed her expression into one of concerned sympathy. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I called James Henderson. "She's stealing from me," I told him, "and she's setting it up to look like I'm too confused to manage my own finances. Can you prove it?" he asked. I looked at the credit card statement, at the charges I'd never authorized, at the pattern of financial manipulation that was designed to make me appear incompetent. "Yes," I said. "I think I can." The next 3 weeks were the longest of my life. I had to continue pretending that nothing had changed while secretly gathering the evidence that would expose Yara's schemes. Every day felt like walking on a tightrope, knowing that one wrong move could alert her to what I'd discovered. James Henderson worked quickly to trace the financial irregularities. The credit card charges that I hadn't authorized totaled over $2,000 across 3 months. The landscaping company had no record of work being done at our address. The clothing store purchases had been made with a card I'd never seen, but one that was somehow linked to my account. "It's sophisticated," James told me during one of our secret meetings at his office. "She's been gradually testing the system, making small, unauthorized charges to see if you'd notice. When you didn't catch them immediately, she got bolder. But how did she get access to my account information?" "That's the clever part," James said, pulling out a folder thick with documentation. "She convinced your husband to add her as an authorized user on your account, ostensibly to help manage your finances when you became confused. The bank has records of Robert calling to make the change." My stomach dropped. "Robert authorized this?" "Under false pretenses, yes. She told him you'd been having trouble managing bills and that adding her to the account would allow her to help you. She even provided examples of the missed payments that we now know she caused herself. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she'd done to me directly. Robert had signed away my financial independence based on lies, and he'd done it without discussing it with me first. "There's more," James continued. "I've been monitoring the bank activity since you hired me. She's been gradually moving money from your joint accounts into a savings account that only she and Marcus have access to. Small amounts each week, never enough to trigger automatic alerts, but it adds up to nearly $15,000 over 6 months. I felt sick. What can we do? We have enough evidence to file criminal charges for fraud and theft. But I think there's a better way to handle this, one that will protect you more effectively in the long run." James opened another file. I've drafted a new will for Robert, one that not only protects your interests, but also includes specific language about undue influence and financial manipulation. We're going to present both Robert and Yara with all the evidence at once and give them a choice. What kind of choice? Robert can sign the new will and remove Yara's access to all accounts, or we can proceed with criminal charges and let the courts sort it out. Either way, her manipulation ends today. But I never got the chance to confront them the way James and I had planned. 3 days later, I was in the kitchen making Robert's morning coffee when I heard a crash from his study. I ran to find him collapsed on the floor, his face gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. Robert! I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I felt for his pulse. It was racing and irregular. I grabbed the phone and called 911, then called Dr. Patterson, Robert's cardiologist. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, but those 8 minutes felt like hours. As the paramedics worked on Robert, I called Marcus and Lisa to tell them what had happened. David was in meetings all day, but I left urgent messages for him to call me back. At the hospital, the news was as serious as I'd feared. Robert had suffered a major heart attack, and the damage to his heart muscle was extensive. Dr. Patterson was blunt about the prognosis. "The next 72 hours are critical," he told me as we stood outside the cardiac intensive care unit. "If he stabilizes, we'll have a better idea of what we're dealing with. But you should prepare yourself for the possibility that this could be the beginning of the end." I sat by Robert's bedside for the next 3 days, holding his hand and talking to him even though he was sedated and on a ventilator. The children took turns staying with me, and even David managed to fly in from Seattle. Yara, of course, positioned herself as the grieving daughter-in-law, bringing flowers and food, and making sure everyone knew how much she was suffering. But I noticed that she spent more time in the hallway making phone calls than she did at Robert's bedside. On the 3rd day, Robert's condition stabilized enough for the doctors to reduce his sedation. When he finally opened his eyes and saw me sitting beside him, he tried to speak around the breathing tube. "It's okay," I whispered, squeezing his hand. "Don't try to talk, just rest." But he was agitated, trying to tell me something. When the respiratory therapist removed the breathing tube an hour later, his first words were barely audible. "Faye, I'm sorry." "Sorry for what, sweetheart? You didn't do anything wrong." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "The will, what she told me. I should have talked to you." My heart clenched. Even now, even lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life, he was thinking about what Yara had convinced him to do. "Robert, we need to talk about that," I said gently. "There are some things you need to know." Over the next hour, speaking in whispers so the nurses wouldn't overhear, I told Robert everything. About the conversations I'd overheard, about the financial manipulation, about the systematic way Yara had been undermining my competence and independence. Robert listened with growing horror, occasionally shaking his head or whispering, "No, that can't be right." But as I provided specific examples, dates, and details, I watched the realization dawn in his eyes. "She showed me receipts," he said weakly, "proof that you'd been making mistakes." "Receipts she fabricated," I said. "James Henderson has been investigating Robert. She's been stealing from us and making it look like I was too confused to notice." Robert closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he opened them again, and I saw something I hadn't seen in months. The man I'd married, clear-headed and determined. "What do we do?" he asked. "We fix this," I said. "Together." That afternoon, while Yara was at home getting some rest, James Henderson came to the hospital. He brought with him a portable notary and all the documentation we'd gathered about Yara's schemes. Robert read through everything slowly, stopping frequently to rest, but his resolve never wavered. When he saw the bank records showing the unauthorized transfers, when he read the medical evaluations confirming my mental competency, when he understood the full scope of what Yara had done, his anger was almost frightening. "She used my love for you against both of us," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since the heart attack. "She made me believe I was protecting you when I was actually endangering you." The new will was comprehensive. It left everything to me, as our original will had specified. but it also included detailed language about undue influence and specific instructions that no one except me could make decisions about my care or finances. James had also added a codicil that would automatically trigger a criminal investigation if anything suspicious happened to either Robert or me. "This isn't just about protecting your assets," James explained as Robert signed the documents. "This is about making sure Yara can never manipulate another elderly person the way she manipulated you." Robert signed the will with a shaking hand, but his signature was clear and strong. The notary confirmed his mental competency and witnessed the signing. Within an hour, the new will was filed with the court and copies were secured in James's safe. "Now what?" Robert asked, exhaustion evident in his voice. "Now we wait," I said. "And when you're stronger, we tell the family what we've discovered." But we didn't have to wait long. The next morning, as I was helping Robert with his breakfast, Yara arrived with Marcus and a thick folder of papers. "Robert," she said, her voice full of false urgency, "we need to get these documents signed while you're lucid. The doctors aren't sure how the medication might affect your thinking, and we can't afford to wait." She spread the papers on Robert's bedside table, the same property transfer documents and revised will that she'd been pressuring him to sign for months. "What's the rush?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She thought Robert was dying, and she wanted to secure her control before it was too late. "We're just being practical," Marcus said, though he looked uncomfortable. "Dad's condition is serious, and we need to make sure everything is in order." Robert looked at the papers, then at me, then at Yara. When he spoke, his voice was calm but cold. "I won't be signing those," he said. "In fact, I have something else to show you." He reached for the folder on his nightstand, the one containing all the evidence of Yara's manipulation and theft. "Yara," Robert said, his eyes never leaving her face, "I know what you've been doing." The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. "I don't know what you mean." "The credit card charges, the unauthorized bank transfers, the lies you told me about Faye's mental health." Robert's voice was getting stronger with each word. "I know all of it." Yara looked around the room desperately, as if searching for an escape route. Marcus stood frozen, clearly confused about what was happening. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Marcus asked. Robert handed him the folder. "Look at the bank records, son. Look at what your wife has been doing to your mother and me." As Marcus read through the documentation, I watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief to anger. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements, credit card records, medical evaluations, witness statements from Ruth and Mrs. Patterson. "Yara," Marcus said, his voice barely controlled, "please tell me this isn't true." But Yara wasn't listening to him anymore. She was staring at Robert with pure hatred, the mask of loving concern finally stripped away. "You were dying," she hissed. "You were supposed to die without making a fuss. I spent 2 years setting this up perfectly, and now you're going to ruin everything." The words hung in the air like poison. Even Marcus stepped back from her, horrified by what she'd just revealed. "Get out," Robert said, his voice flat and final. "Get out of this room, get out of our lives, and pray that I don't decide to press charges." Yara grabbed her purse and headed for the door, but she paused at the threshold to deliver one final blow. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at me. "You think you've won, but I'll make sure you regret this." After she left, the room was silent except for the steady beeping of Robert's heart monitor. Marcus was still standing there, holding the folder, looking like his entire world had just collapsed. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice broken. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Robert reached out and took his son's hand. "She fooled all of us, son. The important thing is that it's over now." But even as Robert spoke those words, I had a feeling that Yara's threats weren't empty. She'd invested too much time and effort in her schemes to walk away quietly. I was right. 3 weeks later, on the day of Robert's funeral, she made her final desperate move. Robert lived for 2 more weeks after our confrontation with Yara. They were perhaps the best 2 weeks we'd had in years, despite the hospital setting and his declining health. With Yara's influence finally removed, Robert was able to see clearly again, and we spent those precious days talking about our life together, our children, and what I would do after he was gone. "I'm proud of you," he told me the night before he passed. "You were stronger than I was. You saw through her when I couldn't. We protected each other," I said, holding his hand as his breathing grew more labored. "That's what we always did." Robert died peacefully in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in October. I was sitting beside his bed, reading him passages from a novel we'd enjoyed together years earlier. One moment he was listening, occasionally squeezing my hand, and the next he was gone. The grief was overwhelming, but it was clean grief. The natural sorrow of losing someone you've loved for 43 years. It wasn't complicated by anger or regret or unfinished business. Robert and I had made our peace with each other, and with the truth. Planning the funeral was surprisingly healing. Marcus had filed for divorce from Yara within days of learning about her schemes, and he threw himself into helping me with the arrangements. Lisa flew in from Portland and stayed for a week, and David managed to take time off work to help as well. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening," Lisa said as we went through Robert's clothes, deciding what to donate and what to keep. "I should have paid more attention." "She was very good at what she did," I replied. "She made it look like normal family concern." David was more direct. "I should have called more often. I should have visited more. If I had, maybe I would have noticed that something was wrong." I looked at my youngest child, now 42 years old but still carrying the guilt of the son who'd moved away from home. "David, you couldn't have known. None of us could have predicted that someone would systematically manipulate our family this way." The 3 days before the funeral were spent reconnecting with my children, rebuilding relationships that Yara had carefully damaged over the years. I learned that she'd told Lisa I was hurt, that she didn't call more often. She'd told David that I found his career choices disappointing. She'd told Marcus that his siblings were jealous of his position as the local son. Each lie was designed to create distance, to isolate me from my support system while positioning herself as my primary caretaker. But with the truth finally revealed, my children were eager to make up for lost time. The morning of the funeral, I stood in my bedroom getting dressed, thinking about how different this day would have been if Yara had succeeded in her plans. I would have been homeless, penniless, possibly committed to a facility against my will. Instead, I was preparing to bury my husband from the home we'd shared for 43 years, surrounded by children who finally understood how much I loved them. The service was beautiful. Marcus gave a eulogy that spoke about Robert's integrity and his love for his family. Lisa read a poem about enduring love. David shared memories of the father who'd taught him to fish and helped him with homework. I spoke last, thanking everyone for their support and sharing my favorite memory of Robert, the day he'd proposed to me in this same cemetery, beside his grandfather's grave, promising to love me until death and beyond. After the service, as we made our way to the graveside, I noticed several people I didn't recognize standing at the edge of the gathering. They looked official, serious, and I wondered if they were colleagues of Robert's that I'd forgotten to invite personally. It wasn't until after the burial, when most of the mourners had gone back to their cars, that one of them approached me. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Detective Sarah Rodriguez with the County District Attorney's Office. I wonder if we could speak privately for a moment." My heart skipped. "Is something wrong? We've been investigating some financial irregularities that were brought to our attention," she said carefully. "I understand your daughter-in-law, Yara Whitmore, may have had unauthorized access to your accounts?" I looked around and saw that Yara was standing about 50 feet away, watching our conversation with obvious anxiety. Marcus was beside her, and they appeared to be having an intense discussion. "That's correct," I said. "My lawyer, James Henderson, has all the documentation." "We've been in touch with Mr. Henderson," Detective Rodriguez said. "The evidence is quite comprehensive. Mrs. Whitmore has agreed to cooperate with our investigation in exchange for a plea agreement, but we wanted to get your input on how you'd like us to proceed." I looked at Yara again. She was no longer the confident, manipulative woman who'd tried to steal my life. She looked small and frightened, clinging to Marcus's arm, even though he was clearly pulling away from her. "What are my options?" I asked. "You could press for full prosecution, which would likely result in felony charges for financial fraud and elder abuse. Or you could accept the plea agreement, which would require her to pay full restitution, complete community service, and stay away from you permanently. I thought about Robert, about what he would have wanted. He'd been angry about Yara's betrayal, but he'd also been a man who believed in second chances and redemption. What does the plea agreement require specifically? Full restitution of the $17,300 she stole, plus interest and penalties. 200 hours of community service, working with elderly abuse prevention programs, 5 years of probation, and a permanent restraining order preventing her from contacting you or coming within 500 feet of your home. I looked at Yara one more time, then back at Detective Rodriguez. I'll accept the plea agreement, but I want the community service to be specifically focused on educating people about financial manipulation of elderly adults. If she's going to avoid prison, she's going to spend her time helping prevent other families from going through what we did. That can be arranged, Detective Rodriguez said. The judge will need to approve the terms, but I think your proposal is very reasonable. As the detective walked away to finalize the arrangements, Marcus approached me. His face was drawn with exhaustion and shame. "Mom, I don't know how to apologize for what she did," he said. "I don't know how to make this right." I took his hands in mine, the same hands I'd held when he'd taken his first steps, when he'd graduated from high school, when he'd gotten married. "You don't need to apologize for her choices, Marcus. You're not responsible for what she did. But I should have seen it. I should have protected you." "Sweetheart, she fooled your father and me too. She was very good at what she did." I squeezed his hands. "The important thing is what we do now. Are you going to be okay?" Marcus looked over at Yara, who was now talking to her own lawyer, no longer even pretending to grieve for Robert. "I've already filed for divorce. I can't be married to someone who would do what she did to you and Dad." 6 months later, my life had settled into a new rhythm. The house felt different without Robert, but it was still home. I'd redecorated his study, turning it into a reading room with comfortable chairs and good lighting. The walls were covered with family photos, real ones this time, including recent pictures of my children and grandchildren. Marcus had moved into a small apartment across town and was slowly rebuilding his life. The divorce had been finalized quickly once Yara's crimes became public record. He came for dinner every Sunday, and we were learning to have a relationship that wasn't filtered through his ex-wife's manipulations. Lisa called twice a week now, and we were planning a trip to visit David and his family in Seattle. The distance that Yara had created between us was gradually healing, replaced by honest communication and genuine affection. The restitution money had been paid in full, but I donated most of it to a local organization that provided legal assistance to elderly victims of financial abuse. Keeping the money felt wrong somehow, like profiting from the pain Yara had caused our family. Mrs. Patterson next door had become a close friend, often joining me for morning coffee and evening walks around the neighborhood. She'd been right about needing a lawyer, and her advice had ultimately saved my independence and my family's relationships. Ruth and I had resumed our weekly bridge games, and I'd joined a book club at the library. For the first time in years, I felt free to make social plans without worrying about whether Yara would approve or find ways to sabotage them. One afternoon in spring, as I was working in the garden Robert and I had planted together 20 years ago, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked up to see Marcus getting out of his truck, carrying a small potted plant. "What's that?" I asked, wiping dirt from my hands. "A rose bush," he said, smiling. "The same variety Dad planted for you on your 20th anniversary. I thought maybe we could plant it together." We spent the afternoon working side by side, preparing the soil and carefully transplanting the young rose bush to a spot where it would get morning sun and afternoon shade. As we worked, Marcus talked about his plans for the future. He was thinking about going back to school, maybe pursuing the teaching career he'd abandoned when he married Yara. "I feel like I lost myself somewhere along the way," he said, tamping down the soil around the new plant. "I became who she wanted me to be instead of who I really am." I understood that feeling completely. The good news is that it's never too late to find yourself again. As the sun began to set, we sat on the back porch with glasses of iced tea, admiring our work. The new rosebush looked small and vulnerable next to the established plants around it, but I could envision how beautiful it would be in a few years when it had time to grow and flourish. "Mom," Marcus said suddenly, "I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about Dad's funeral, about what Yara tried to do that day." I waited, sensing that this was important. When she handed you those papers and tried to humiliate you in front of everyone, I was horrified, but I was also proud. Proud? You didn't react the way she expected. You didn't get angry or defensive or break down crying. You just smiled and pulled out that will, like you'd been planning for that moment all along. Marcus shook his head in admiration. It was like watching David face Goliath. Except David was a 67-year-old woman with more strength and dignity than anyone gave her credit for. I felt tears prick my eyes. I was terrified, actually, but I knew that if I let her win that day, she'd have destroyed everything your father and I had built together. Well, you didn't let her win, and because of that, our family survived. Marcus reached over and squeezed my hand. Dad would be so proud of how you handled all of this. As darkness fell and Marcus prepared to leave, I walked him to his truck. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful in the way that small towns become when families are settling in for the evening. "Will you be okay here by yourself?" Marcus asked, as he did every time he visited. I looked back at the house, at the porch light glowing warm and welcoming, at the garden we'd just worked in together. "I'll be fine," I said, and for the first time since Robert's death, I truly meant it. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living again on my own terms, in my own home, surrounded by people who loved me for who I really was. Yara had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a confused old woman who couldn't take care of herself. Instead, she'd helped me discover just how strong I really was. After Marcus drove away, I sat on the front porch for a while, listening to the evening sounds of my neighborhood. A dog barking in the distance, children playing in a nearby yard, the soft rustle of wind through the oak trees that had been here when Robert and I first bought this house. Tomorrow, Ruth and I were going to drive to the state capitol to visit the elder care advocacy group that had been formed partly in response to cases like mine. I'd been invited to speak about my experience, to help other families recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation. It wasn't the retirement I'd planned, but it was meaningful work. And it was mine to choose. Just as this house was mine, just as my relationships with my children were mine to rebuild and nurture. Robert had been right about one thing. I was stronger than either of us had realized. Strong enough to see through Yara's lies, strong enough to fight for the truth, and strong enough to build a new life from the ashes of what she'd tried to destroy. As I prepared to go inside, I noticed the small envelope tucked under the doormat. For a moment, my heart raced. Was Yara violating the restraining order? But when I opened it, I found a hand-drawn card from my granddaughter, Emma, Marcus's daughter from his first marriage. The front showed a stick figure woman standing in front of a house, with the words Grandma Faye's house written in careful 7-year-old handwriting. Inside, the message was simple. "Thank you for keeping our family together. Love, Emma." I held the card against my chest and smiled. Yes, I was going to be just fine. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.